सांस देखते देखते चित अविचल हो जाए, अविचल चित निर्मल बने.
Whether one is listening to this in Myanmar or from outside the country, we know it is a very difficult time for those of us who hold the Golden Land and its people in our hearts. In trying times like these, we can all use a bit more care and compassion in our lives. So on behalf of the team here at Insight Myanmar, I would like to say, in the traditional way metta is offered, may you be free from physical discomfort. May you be free from mental discomfort. May you not meet dangers or enemies. May you live a peaceful and happy life. And may all beings be free and come out of suffering. And with that, let's move on to the show. We're pleased to welcome for this episode of Insight Myanmar podcast, Barry Lapine, who is going to talk about his spiritual journey, where it intersects with India and Burma, and particularly the lineage, largely Burmese lineage of SN Goenka, and his current role in being a teacher in Massachusetts in the SN Goenka Vipassana organization. We're going to go back to the beginning and get to present day. So Barry, thanks so much for taking the time to join us for this chat.
You're welcome, and I'm happy to be here, Joa.
Yeah, so great. Let's. There's a lot to cover. We'll try to get in as much as we can, but as we do with many of these interviews, let's start to where it began. So before your early interest in spirituality and meditation and travel, tell us a bit about your growing up and your family life.
Well, I am from outside of New York City, about 50 miles north on the Hudson River. Had a traditional middle-class upbringing, went to public high school, went to university as part of the State University of New York. But one story I remember very well is when I was in 8th grade, my mother asked me, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And I said to her, I remember saying clearly, "I just want to be happy." And I was not. I was not happy. I did all the things a, quote, bad kid would do as far as intoxicants in high school, intoxicants in college. I did finish college. I did graduate with an engineering degree in 1969. And at that time, as many of your listeners will remember, it was the middle of the Vietnam War. And much like one of your other interviewees, Michael Stein, I wasn't very happy in this country at that time. I had gone to Woodstock. I traveled around the country a bit, but there was certainly something missing. And consequently, I ended up, again, like Michael, I ended up in Israel with the idea that I would live on a kibbutz for the rest of my life. I always loved the idea of working very hard, but for the common good, not necessarily just to make a living. It wasn't just about money. So at that time on a kibbutz, I did work very hard, but was for the common good of all the people who lived there. But at that point, I was told that you are Jewish, you belong in Israel, and consequently you belong in the Israeli army as well. And at that point, I said, well, I didn't join the army in the US, and I certainly was not going to join the army in Israel. And fortunately, I was looking through an old Life magazine at that time on the kibbutz in Israel. And it was when I saw a 2-page picture, black and white picture of a young American sitting in the mountains of New Mexico, watching the sunrise come up. He was sitting in full lotus position. Absolutely beautiful picture. And alarms just went off in my head. You got to go to India. I knew nothing about India, but I saw that picture. I was determined. I ran off to Tel Aviv and I bought a book on yoga. And I remember in that book, the last thing that was listed as far as benefits of yoga was number 9, and it said the complete purification of all psychosomatic illnesses. And it just rang some more bells. This is exactly what I was looking for. And very soon after that, with 2 friends from college, a married couple, we flew to Turkey from Israel and started that same overland journey that a number of your interviewees have already spoken about. It was hitchhiking, it was buses, it was walking, it was through Turkey, Iran, up to the Caspian Sea in Iran, which was wonderful, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and then on to India. And I remember my very first night in India. We spent that night in a train station at the border, and an old man there at the station was teaching me how to drink water through my nose, and customs people had bought me my first cup of chai, and it was like coming home. When I walked across the border from Pakistan to India, it was clearly coming home. I was so comfortable there, and immediately went up and spent a couple of months in Kashmir. And Kashmir at that time, there was no war going on in Kashmir. And it was absolutely beautiful and wonderful. And then from there, after a couple of months, it was on to Nepal, Swayambhu, Kathmandu, and just lived there, but was still looking, didn't know what I was doing. And then one day, a woman who was living in the same house as I was said, well, I'm going to Goa, which you know about, a beach on the west coast of India for the winter. And I said, well, I'm going to Puri, which was a beach on the east coast of India. And she said, let's go to Bodhgaya together. And then you go your way, I'll go my way. So we did that. We went to Bodhgaya together, and she was falling asleep everywhere we went. And turns out she had hepatitis. And the last place we went to look for a place to stay was the Burmese Vihara, who welcomed us with open arms. And getting to the Burmese Vihara was also like coming home. So very quickly, within a few days, Munindra was there, Joseph was there, a number of other people were there who were, Graham White was there, the monk, from the Thai monk, Joseph Goldstein, and his mother came very soon. And I remember one of those first nights when Munindra was there, we were all upstairs in the meditation room at the Vihara, and Munindra came up and he said, my name is Munindra and I teach vipassana meditation. And this is just exactly what I needed to hear. So all of those travels were leading me at that time to Bodhgaya. So I spent about 2.5 months practicing exactly what Munindra taught me. So he was my first teacher. But then one night he came up to the meditation hall, and he said, tomorrow, my friend S.N. Goenka is coming to teach a 10-day course. I want all of you to sit that course. And sure enough, the next day Goenka arrived. So
that's great. That's a great wind up to what a special journey of going to India and looking for something. Actually, that's where I was going to go next, is that I wanted to make that connection. You talked about seeing this picture of this young man watching a sunset in lotus position, and that driving you to India. So did you know exactly what you were looking for there? Were you looking for some vague sense of spirituality or something more specific with some type of yoga or vipassana meditation practice? Or where was that connection of that initial interest and seed that then led you to something in India?
Yeah, well, I think the seed was already planted because I knew I wanted to be happy and I knew I was miserable. So the seed was
Hmm.
there, just like I had told my mother back in 8th grade. I just want to be happy. And going through college, especially university days, it was a time of LSD. It was a time of smoking a lot of grass. And, I started having issues just within my own psyche. I just kept doing it anyway and doing a lot of alcohol, and eventually I stopped taking acid. I stopped smoking dope. I stopped alcohol, and I was still having the same sort of, let's say, psychic or mental issues, mental health issues.
Hmm.
And all of a sudden, I realized there is nothing left to stop. This is me. This is what's in me. I need to find something that I can deal with my stuff. And that led to everything else. That led to eventually finding my way to Bodhgaya. And, the moment, when I met Munindra, I was just in love with him from the very beginning. He was my first teacher. And
Hmm.
I practiced exactly what he told me for 2.5 months. And one quick little aside, if we were mindfully walking to Bodhgaya into the village for a lunch, say, and we were mindfully going really slowly, it would take a very long time to get to lunch, so it was, we just tried to incorporate everything he taught in everything we did. And in the evenings, he would come up and he would give discourses. And Munindra was great. He was so well educated, and he was like a mother to us. He was so easy to be with. He was simple and loving. And Goenka, he was more like father, and Munindra was more like mother. But, once I met Goenka, and he was very close to Munindra. In fact, my very first course that next day, Munindra sat on the floor next to Goenka, who was on a dais, and faced the students. So he essentially was Goenka's first assistant, even though he had never even practiced the technique that Goenka was teaching. They were that close. This is
Hmm.
about a year or two before Goenka's wife Mataji came to India. So there's a lot of interaction between Munindra and Goenka. Now, Goenka had come to Bodhgaya at that time to teach one course. And it turns out he sat 4 courses, or he conducted 4 courses. And then after that, he did his own self-course at the Mahabodhi temple every night. And I could tell you a little bit about even the first courses that he taught in India in English. I think it would be good for people to hear that. There was a couple who was living up in Dalhousie, which is up in the Himalayas. It used to be a sort of a summer resort for like lieutenants and lower end officers of the British Army. And so there's some, decent homes there and all of that. So there was a couple living there who used to be cooks in the hippie days of Haight-Ashbury. So they found themselves in Dalhousie, and they wanted to learn how to meditate. And I would say this is probably around September or so of 1970. So they wrote to a number of Buddhist teachers in Burma, in Thailand, probably Cambodia, Laos. I think there was about 13 different teachers they wrote to. U Ba Khin was one of those teachers, and he wrote
Oh,
back to them, and he
oh,
said to them, "My teaching representative in India is S.N. Goenka." And
wow.
at the same time, he wrote to Goenka. And as you've heard from other people, Goenka was extremely devoted to U Ba Khin. U Ba
Hmm.
Khin was his teacher, and I've never seen gratitude like that in my life. And so
Yeah.
U Ba Khin said to him, I want you to go up to Dalhousie and teach these people. There was about
Hmm.
12 or 13 people up there who did that first course. So he went. And he was very unsure of his English. He spoke mostly Hindi, Burmese. He was a businessman, so he did have English, but not that good. So he was concerned about that. So he said the first night's discourse, it took about 20 minutes. He could only speak in English for 20 minutes. Next day,
Hmm.
20 minutes. He said by the third day, it was 1 hour. It just started flowing very easily. It was not an issue at all.
Hmm.
And, to this day, the discourses are not that different than they were back
Hmm.
in 1970. So
Hmm.
from Dalhousie, I think most, maybe all of those students, those 12 or 13 students, followed him to New Delhi, where he did the second course in English. And at that time, Ram Dass and his group of people, they were in Delhi. I believe it was at a yoga conference or something. They wanted to meditate, but they couldn't. The time wasn't there. So Goenkaji told them to come to Bodhgaya, which they did. So we did the first course with Goenkaji in December of 70 in Bodhgaya. And then he went over to the Samanvaya ashram, a Gandhi ashram, and did a second course there with Ram Dass and his group, and told all of us at the Vihara, just come down and sit the group sittings with us, which we did. And then he came back to the Burmese Vihara to teach, well, it turns out, another couple of courses. And during one of those courses in early January 19th, actually, he got a telegram saying that U Ba Khin had died in Burma. And obviously a big shock to Goenkaji. He never expected that. And so he finished the course, he finished the next course, and then he did his own self-course. And it was only during that self-course, he sat with one other person at self-course, where they would sit all night in the Mahabodhi temple, and they would rest during the day or meditate in their own rooms. And then they go back to the temple. And he did that, I think it was a 10-day course. But he said that during that self-course, that very first self-course, is when he said that to himself that he was going to devote the rest of his life to the teaching of Vipassana meditation. And that's where a real ball started rolling in India.
Gosh, that's a really interesting history and background. Mine is just reeling with several directions I want to go and finding out more information. But I guess one of the things I'm thinking is just as Goenkaji is starting his teaching career, I think one of the things that's on my mind is that for many of us listening who have taken any kind of course in any capacity, for almost all of us, we can't really conceptualize Goenkaji as anything other than a master meditation teacher, a teacher of teachers, a businessman, an organizer, everything he's done with the movement and the organization. And it kind of reminds me about, like, you have your beloved grandfather and you can't really ever imagine your grandfather being anything but a grandfather. And yet when Goenkaji's starting his mission, we have to put ourselves back there and remember that he doesn't really have a lot of experience doing this. He's been a student in Burma, and he did. There is a note that U Ba Khin at one point took him to Pyongyang, and they did something with a couple courses there. I don't know what that was. I don't even really know what would have been what would have constituted a course back at that time in the way that they imagined it.
U Ba Khin had a very strong sense that Goenkaji's mission in India and the rest of the world was different than his own mission in Burma. He knew that he was going to places where Dhamma was not established. India, the Americas, Australia, New Zealand, Europe, all that. So U Ba Khin wanted Goenkaji to get acclimated to be able to conduct courses, to teach in all kinds of places. Places that you would even want to go into. And he did that. He taught in guest houses. He taught in churches. He taught in mosques. He taught in hotels. He taught everywhere. So Sayagyi, knowing what Goenkaji's mission was going to be, he took him to a number of different places in Burma to conduct courses in facilities, in vibrations, if you like, that were going to be similar to what he was going to be doing when he left Burma. And keep in mind that U Ba Khin himself is the one that wanted to go to India.
Right.
That was his dream, was to teach himself outside India. But due to the political situation in Burma, even back then, he was never able to get out. It was just Goenkaji's good fortune that the government of Burma gave him a passport and a visa, but only earmarked it for India. And that was only for a period of 3 months, to be able to go teach his mother and father in India, which is the reason he originally went to India in the first place. So he taught his first course in a guest house in the middle of Bombay, in a place that I eventually did sit a course in myself, but it was in the middle of the sheet metal bazaar. So all you hear is these people banging on sheet metal all night long.
Oh my gosh.
So this is, I believe, my own view is that Sayagyi wanted to get him acclimated to teaching in all kinds of situations.
Right. And we've had other guests who've come on and have pointed out that the way that Goenkaji was able to formulate his teaching and his connections and networks and audience and such in India, they're ways that wouldn't necessarily have occurred to a more traditional Burmese Buddhist as U Ba Khin. And so when he's starting out his teaching career, I understand that he had some kind of training with Ubikin, although I don't know how much that really could prepare him for what was ahead. But I wonder if, like, thinking back as before we get into Goenka as this master teacher, this leader of the organization of a movement, really an international worldwide movement, which is the way we all kind of think of him today. Can you share a bit about your sentiments or perception of what really stood out, if you can remember, if you could put yourself back there, in contrast perhaps even, or perhaps the seeds of what would develop into something greater later, of how you might characterize him as an early teacher, as he's finding his footing, as he's charting new territory, exploring a new path, and setting the kind of trial and error of setting something up and seeing
Mhm.
where he has to change things and move ahead.
He did change things over the years. I just give you a simple example. You've done courses, Joe, so the group sittings with the teacher are always 8 to 9 in the morning, 2:30, 3:30 in the afternoon, and we do 6 to 7 now in the evening. But traditionally, that third group sitting was 8 to 9 in the evening. So people would sit 6 to 7 themselves, then the discourse. And Goenkaji started that way, but his discourses quickly got too long, and that group sitting became maybe 45 minutes or even a half an hour. So in that sense, he changed things. So he made the group sitting 6 to 7 in the evening. But I would say more than anything, it was his ability and his skill set to communicate to large groups of people, to masses of people,
Hmm.
and his deep, deep understanding of the essence of the Dhamma, not just the tradition of what he grew up in himself, but the very essence of Dhamma. And he often said that, Goenkaji did his first course, I think it was like 54, 56, something like that. And
Hmm.
then he said he spent 14 years with U Ba Khin, just, his business was all nationalized, so he had time.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
well, he spent a lot of time at the center, a lot of time with U Ba Khin, which he called his golden years. And he said that U Ba Khin had been training him all that time and he did not even know it. So,
Mm.
right from the very beginning, Goenkaji's skill set was already there. His ability to
Mm.
give discourses was already there. Like he says, he used to
Hmm.
give discourses on the Bhagavad Gita, on the Upanishad, and other things. He was a master Hindi speaker right from the beginning. And so that skill set was there. U Ba Khin trained him, taught him this
Hmm.
practice, and, one thing I find very interesting, even from the very beginning with Goenkaji, when I met him, he, this courses that he taught, they were never about Goenkaji. He
Hmm.
always said, I am just a vehicle. Sayaji's the teacher. In fact, he even told me once when I did something that he was not real pleased about in India, he said, you have to be really careful because you are a direct representative of U Ba Khin. And so
Mm.
you have to behave accordingly. Goenkaji's
Hmm.
behavior was exemplary. His,
Mm.
his adherence to morality was
Hmm.
exemplary. His
Hmm.
ability to speak about the technique in a universal way that still adhered so specifically and perfectly with the Buddha's teachings, even in the Pali scriptures, discourses, other teachers, etc. Uh, he had this unique ability to be able to work with anybody from any culture and be able to
Yeah.
put the Buddhist teachers in words that those people would be able to relate to and be able
Mm.
to practice. So it was never about Goenkaji. And even now, today, the proof is it is not about Goenkaji, even though we are using his recorded materials. It is about the technique. It is about the practice that is important.
And I think one of the amazing things to go back and look at in that period, it talked about with the interview with Michael and several others. I keep coming back to it because I find it such a fascinating lens of analysis, is just to really highlight how unique it is. You have a Indian Hindu who's coming out of Burma, going through all the trauma of the World War II and colonialism. And then there's a military dictatorship. He's living in a closed military dictatorship. And he's then interacting with these young Western hippies representing this counterculture that even elders in their own country don't understand at the moment, don't understand what they're thinking, what they're believing, what they want to do, what they're wearing. And that he's able to not just teach these individuals, but really form these deep connections despite this huge cultural divide between them. And I think that the fact that these by these circumstances of history, these hippies, Western hippies, found themselves in India at that time, and Goenka was there to teach, and that such a connection was made. I think that's something sometimes overlooked, and something I find so fascinating was that he had the ability to reach that community and teach them on such a deep level, really.
It was, he says in his 10-day discourses, on day 10 evening, if you remember, he says, people come for two reasons. One is they already have a seed of Dhamma and they come to develop it. And two, they come just for the seed of Dhamma. Now, many of those Westerners you're talking about, they clearly already had the seed of Dhamma. And going to India at that time, not even knowing why they were going to India, was a magnetic force. It was purely magnetic. I had no idea what I was doing, as did most of the people. But to all of a sudden, Goenkaji, this Hindu man coming out of Burma, nobody had ever heard of him.
Right.
But the magnetism that he had, and it wasn't just hippies, it was everybody. All his first courses were in Hindi, and here he is. Sure. He certainly could relate to the Indian community, and the Indians all grew up thinking that you don't believe in the Buddha's teaching. You may accept him as an incarnation of God, but his teachings don't have anything to do with them. You don't believe in God. He doesn't believe in soul, all that sort of thing. Goenkaji was able to navigate all of that based on his personal experience in Burma because of the technique, and also because this is exactly what he went through in Burma when he first started practicing. He had that same conditioning. Now, so he first started teaching Indians, but then Uba Khin tells him to teach the Westerners as well. And he took that same skill set of communication and ability. The Buddha himself gave a discourse, which Goenkaji has repeated, about qualities of a good teacher. And one of those qualities is knowing the people you are trying to teach, and to some extent knowing the cultural background of those people, and being able to communicate with them in a way that they will understand the practice itself. Now, Goenkaji did not really understand the hippies, but he related to them. He knew his mission was to spread seeds of Dhamma all over the world. He knew that. And all of a sudden, he sees people from all over the world coming to him, knowing, who am I? But he knew that these people were coming to him to get the Dhamma. So even though he may not have understood their background or their culture, he knew what they needed to get. And he was able to communicate with them in such a way that they did not have to call themselves Buddhist or Hindu or Jewish or Christian or Muslim or anything else. These were all people, and I would say a great majority of them, who were only looking for something to clean up their own minds. And keep in mind, the 60s, the 70s was a sort of a cultural revolution in the West itself, considering, the musical groups, the Beatles, the Stones, the Doors, all of these people. It was a time of searching. And then the Beatles themselves show up in India, and so it was a time where anybody who had that seed was going to be attracted. And how they got there, by boat, by walking, by bus, by horseback, whatever it was, they were going. And having no idea really, except that I'm looking for something that's going to be help me in a world that was so screwed up at that time. And it's screwed up now. But what I think many of us knew was that, we'd go to college, we'd finish college, we'd get jobs, we could make money, but we knew that was not the answer. I certainly knew that. And to be able to end up in India, in this little town of Bodhgaya, whoever heard of Bodhgaya, and meet
Hmm.
Munindra first and then Goenka and become very close to both of them. Um, Clearly, there was a powerful connection before we ever got to India. And I don't think it had a lot to do with India. I thought it has to do with seeds of Dhamma that many of these people already had. Goenka was merely a catalyst to once again awaken that seed and help people to practice, because he knew that it was only this practice that was going to help human beings. It wasn't Goenka helping human beings. It was the practice and the technique that was helping human beings.
Right. So you take your first course, and after a few months of having basically Munindra as your teacher, and then go and take this 10-day course. And I imagine this must have had a huge impact on you. And so describe what happened to you personally after the course and how you were hooked.
Well, the moment I met Goenka, he walked into the meditation hall upstairs in the Burmese Vihara, and as he still does, he started out the course by chanting. And basically that chanting is gratitude to the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha, and his own teacher and family and all of that. As soon as I heard him, I felt in my own mind, this is it. I just met my Dhamma father, my Dhamma teacher. I knew that. There wasn't even a question about it. And, I had nowhere to go. I had a little bit of money to live on. And so I was just going to stay there until that winter was over. As long as he was teaching, I was going to stay there. And so my own commitment to what he was doing and what he was teaching became very strong, very quick, and it satisfied that thirst that I had and that need to find something. I knew how screwed up I was, but all of a sudden I knew I had a practice that was going to help me do that, regardless of time frames. I'd practice this for the rest of my life, and that was 52 years ago, and I haven't stopped since. And even after those courses, Joa, Goenka left Burmese Vihara and after his own self course. So he goes back to Bombay and he carries on with his own schedule, mostly in Hindi. And many of us, I remember Joseph and Sharon and her partner at the time, me, friends, we all went up to Dalhousie and we rented places to live for, say, 6 months.
Mm.
So we would
Hmm.
spend 6 months in the mountains. And a lot of that time was just doing self-course after self-course after self-course. There were no
Mm.
recordings, no group sitting, chanting tapes, or any of that. We just sat, and that's all we did, either sit or walk in the mountains. And we did that until the next winter when we went back to Bodhgaya and Goenka was there again.
So it's this small kind of largely Western spiritual community of these early practitioners, the first students of Goenka's courses, that are then, after they take these courses, then forming this kind of transitory spiritual community and going to different places in India, probably according to the climate at the time. And that you could really kind of point to as the early start of Goenka's mission. Is that correct?
You could say that. I think the early start of his mission was probably in Burma with Sayagyi, but
Hmm.
he did most of his courses in those days were in Hindi. So he
Hmm.
developed a very strong following also in India. Indian
Sure.
students who maybe were not so satisfied with just blindly accepting scripture or gurus or anything like that. And, as Goenka said, when he did his own first course, all of a sudden, by day 5 or day 6, he said, this is just applied Bhagavad Gita. This is applied Upanishads. This is the technique that will enable you to understand all of those scriptures. And I would expand that to say that it's also the technique to help you understand the scriptures of your own religion that you grew up in, if you grew up in any religion at all. And I tell you a quick story. When I first came home from India, I was with my family in Peekskill, New York. And I remember I grew up in the Jewish faith. And I remember they needed another man to go to the synagogue so they had enough people to have a service. And I did that because I had nothing else to do. I went, I didn't mind. And the old cantor of that synagogue, who was quite close to our family, he said to me, I was afraid you were not Jewish anymore because of what you did. And I said to
Hmm.
him, Reverend Domowitz, I am a better Jew than I've ever been in my life. For the first time in my life, I'm actually practicing Shila, morality. I'm trying to clean up my own mind. which makes me a better human being, which will make me a better Jew. And he accepted that, totally accepted it. And I think that is true of many of us who came back. We
Yeah,
did not
right.
come back as religious zealots or converted anything. We came back as better human beings with a technique of how to keep getting better.
That's really interesting. And it's all happening in this, again, we have to say, in this tumultuous time of, in the 1960s, the Vietnam War and some of the tensions in America, and you're overseas going through this. And, it's interesting. You started this whole conversation out by referencing that you knew you weren't happy. And I want to follow up with that. I want to share a bit of a personal anecdote with my first experience on a course and then relate it back to you. My first experience was very different in the sense that I had graduated from college in America. I was living in Japan. I was living in Tokyo. I had this robust group of friends. I was in the big city after coming from a small town where not much ever happened. And as I went into my first course, I thought I was the happiest I'd ever been in my life. I was having, I remember at the time, I would want to even like tear off the calendars of the monthly calendars and just save them for posterity, because I would look at them and be like, oh my God, every day is filled with all these exciting things I'm doing. And of course, being a young person, the nightlife at that time, the intoxicants, the circle of friends, the culture, everything. And after my first course, I had this profound realization that really shook me to my core, that was like, I'm not happy. And I thought I was so happy. I thought that I was living the life. This is everything I had kind of aspired to leading up to that experience. And at the end of my first course, I was like, I am really not happy. I'm really suffering. I thought this was everything I wanted. I got everything I wanted for, my young age at that time, but it's not fulfilling me in the way that I thought it would. And so that set me on a path to start to investigate why these things that I was being driven to, that I thought would make me happy, were ultimately so unfulfilling in ways I hadn't realized until I had that shock of an intensive meditation experience. You, on the other hand, were going into your first course knowing you weren't happy from an even younger age, and searching for happiness, searching for that happiness inside, or the mystery of what it would take to explore that misery and to find that happiness. And so with your first course experience and that kind of binding question that you yourself referenced to start this whole talk off, this early insight when your mother asked you, of realizing you're not happy. So what did that first course and the subsequent courses start to do to you personally in terms of recognizing and feeling a pathway to exploring this relationship between suffering and happiness?
I think that first course I did exactly the same thing as the first course you did. Meaning, when this by experience, Joa, that when you do this practice, it so quickly and so directly goes to the heart of the issues, the deep-rooted cause of our own misery inside. You may have been under the illusion or delusion that you were already happy. I knew I was quite miserable looking for happiness. But the fact is, we both found the same thing, that the cause of the problem is within us. You experienced it by realizing maybe the ephemeral or impermanent nature of all the things you were doing that was such a temporary happiness. There was no lasting happiness there. I, on the other hand, knew that I had a lot of complexes inside and was just looking for a way to be able to learn how to develop some understanding of them. And this technique did exactly that. It did it exactly that at that time, and it still does that for anybody that comes to a course. And that means very quickly and directly, a person goes to the heart of the issue, which is our reaction to the sensations that we feel in the body that may be caused from external sources or internal mental conditioning. And once we realize that we all have this mental conditioning and how we are continually reacting to it by reacting to those physical sensations that we feel, we then have the opportunity to start coming out of that reaction, which means we have the opportunity to come out of the mental conditioning or our karma or whatever we want to call it. And therefore, we can start to understand what does real happiness mean. And that means not being a slave to our own mental conditioning and starting to decondition the mind. Vipassana itself is a deconditioning process. Everything we do in our life, everything is conditioning ourselves, conditioning our minds from the moment we are born. And we are running after pleasant, and running away from unpleasant. Vipassana meditation allows us to observe both of those extremes, learn to experience the impermanent nature of them, start to understand how that when I react to how I feel, I make myself unhappy. And therefore, if I understand that, I can slowly start to come out of the reaction, which means coming out of the conditioning, which means deconditioning the mind, which means I'll be a happier person. So actually, the experience you had and the experience that I had on that first course is not much different.
Sure. So, and you also reference how when you first came to India, your first teacher was Munindra, that it was 2.5 months that he initially taught you. And I'm curious in what ways you reference this this deconditioning, this running after pleasant, running away from unpleasant, that and observing sensations as part of Goenka's teachings. How would you characterize those early teachings of Munindra?
I think it was really the same thing. Munindra, as you know and you've heard, Munindra was a Pali scholar. Munindra spent, I think, about 9 months practicing very intensively under Mahasi Sayadaw. So Munindra was experiential as well as intellectual. He knew both. So it was just a different starting point. In that tradition, the way they learn, from my understanding and my remembrance, is you start with the observation of breath, but whatever else is arising, whether it be a physical sensation, a thought, an emotion, whatever it happens to be, you observe that. And when it's not there, you come back to the breath. So it's a starting point to develop concentration of the mind and then move further from there. Goenkaji's technique was slightly different in the beginning. And that is, okay, let's sharpen the mind first by the practice of Anapana for 3 days or observation of respiration, and reach a stage even in those first 3 days where you could start to feel physical sensations on the body, maybe related to the breath, maybe not related to the breath. But after that, and you start doing Vipassana, you're just trying to understand the arising and passing, the impermanent nature of everything you feel. If you practice the technique as taught by Munindra and as taught by many people in the West now, I believe, and I haven't done that in a long time, but I do believe it will go to the same place. You still, no matter what happens, the student of the teachings of the Buddha has to reach a stage where they are feeling the arising and passing away of physical sensations, because every one of those physical sensations is related to anything that is coming in contact with any sense door or with the mind. Nothing arises in the mind without a corresponding physical sensation on the body. And anything that comes in contact with any of our sense doors, physical sense doors, will also result in a physical sensation on the body. And the mind, which is constantly in touch with the physical sensations of our body, reacts to those sensations ignorantly. It reacts with clinging, craving if it's pleasant, and aversion and hatred if it's unpleasant. So they're just different approaches to what I believe is the same result. And if you practice any of these techniques, as taught by the Buddha in the Satipatthana Sutta, you practice any of these, you have to reach the same stage. It all has to become one if you are practicing properly. And let's also keep in mind, whether you're practicing this tradition or that tradition, the very basis of any practice of the Buddha's teachings has to be morality. It's all about Shila, morality, concentration, samadhi, and the development of wisdom. And in the technique, the way Goenkaji taught it, which is the same as the way U Ba Khin taught it, that development of wisdom with the base of Shila, morality, is the only way to decondition the mind. You can develop mindfulness, awareness, but if you're not developing awareness with the understanding that everything you're aware of is in a constant state of change, experientially, it's just awareness. It will not decondition the mind.
Mm-hmm.
And so what really attracted me about Goenkaji's approach to the practice of the teachings of the Buddha were it was extremely direct, it was very fast, and took you to the heart of the problem quickly, where you could start to develop the kind of equanimity and wisdom needed to actually purify the mind. But what Munindra taught would do the same thing if practiced sincerely with that same base of Shila.
Mm-hmm, right. And I do want to get to the rest of your story. I want to bookmark that of getting to how your journey then took you to America and setting up and establishing the center in the US, as well as your time in Burma. I just want to pause a bit on your trajectory and note that for the listeners of where we're going, and go a bit deeper into some of this more theoretical, because I want to reference something that you brought up just before we interviewed offline, that you wanted, and I think this is a good opportunity to do so, that you wanted to speak to a concern or a criticism that's been out there, that the technique or the organization can sometimes appear, I think your word was narrow-minded or insular, and to give you a chance to expand on both the criticism as you understand it, as well as your response and feeling that might not be the case.
Yeah, I think those who feel that this approach to the teaching of the Buddha, meaning Goenkaji's teaching, is somewhat limited because it all revolves around physical sensations on the body. And we know from different suttas of the Buddha, specifically the Satipatthana Sutta, he talks about sensations, he talks about the body, he talks about the mind and what arises on the mind. And here's Goenkaji talking about physical sensations. Now, what I just said was that whatever arises in the mind, or whatever comes in contact with any of our sense doors, manifests with a physical sensation on the body. For example, let's say in the English language, we say, I feel depressed. I feel angry. I feel passion. I feel whatever I feel. You feel that because something has arisen in the mind, any of those things, and you feel them as physical sensations on the body. So this tradition of meditation immediately and directly goes to that physical sensation on the body and allows the meditator to develop the understanding of anicca or impermanence with that physical sensation. So regardless of whether the sensation came from an exterior source, like someone yelling and screaming at me, external source, or it comes from an internal source, like an emotion on the mind or a thought on the mind. So any of those other three satipatthanas, they all manifest with physical sensation on the body. In fact, I don't want to get too deep into theory here, but the actual law of dependent origination, called paticca samuppada, or really it's the law of karma, is that all these things, this string of events happen that manifest and culminate with a sensation, a physical sensation on the body. And then the mental part, the Vedana, the experience of what's happening on the body, comes into play. And because of our past conditioning, we react to those sensations. So the reality is that this approach, which to some may appear to be narrow, is actually completely open, completely wide, and completely inclusive of everything that's happening: physical, mental, internal, external, because all of those things manifest with physical sensations on the body. That's where we tie up the knots. That's where we can untie them. So it's a very powerful and very direct path to the junction of where we make ourselves miserable or where we can actually liberate ourselves. So not narrow-minded at all, not a narrow path, but a totally all-inclusive path.
In my mind, when I was thinking of that criticism, I was thinking it takes two forms, one being the technique itself and one being perhaps the language or organization around the technique, which we can get to in a moment, because you touched upon the first one, the first part of that in your answer. And so in looking at and examining the criticism that there could be narrow-mindedness based on the technique focusing on the practice of physical sensation, I think here it would be important to highlight that, and again, not to want to get too technical and want to bring as many listeners on the journey with us that maybe haven't had this experience, but to break it down simply, I think one of the thing that distinguishes this particular tradition, which Goenka has also come out and said, is the particular interpretation of Vedana, that other Buddhist traditions don't necessarily interpret the Pali word Vedana as being physical sensation and might interpret it as a mental feeling or something other than a physical feeling, whereas this tradition is specifically focused on Vedana as being physical sensation and only physical sensation. So maybe if you can...
The physical sensation is indeed a physical sensation. It's part of kaya, the body. It is the mind. The part of the mind called Vedana is mental, which experiences those physical sensations. They're very different, but it's only Vedana, mental, that can experience the physical. Goenkaji had many, many interactions with the Sangha, with monks, very highly regarded monks. And he explained all of this to them. And he was so good at simple explanations that they all understood. They did get it, what he was saying. For example, people would say, Goenkaji would often say, I'm not teaching Buddhism, I'm teaching Dhamma. And the monks were not so happy about that. But when he explained to them, if you look in the scriptures, all of the Buddhist scriptures, you never see the word Buddhism. You see the word Dhamma. Dhamma is universal. The technique has to be universal. So whether we adhere to this approach to the teaching of the Buddha or another approach, every one of those approaches, and if you read the Satipatthana Sutta, every one of those approaches lead to the same thing, the arising and passing away of all phenomena. And how will you really know the arising and passing away of phenomena unless you directly experiencing them by feeling those phenomena? And like I said before, everything that arises internally or externally manifests with a physical sensation on the body, and that's what the mind, Vedana, is going to be reacting to. Vedana being just part of the mind, one part of the mind. So this is not something outside of the teaching of the Buddha, but in my mind, I feel it's actually the essence and the heart of what the Buddha taught. Because let's keep in mind what the Buddha wanted was for people to get liberated. He's not just teaching a technique to make people feel better. The Buddha was teaching a technique to completely liberate the mind. And from my experience of quite a long time, I believe this is exactly what this technique does. I'm not criticizing and won't go there as far as criticizing any other practice. I do understand what Munindra taught. He was my first teacher. And I loved him, and I saw him shortly before he died. And I could tell you a sweet story about that. But I can't think of a sweeter human being than Munindra was. And with a depth of understanding, he taught Goenkaji so much regarding the scriptures. And they had so many long conversations that I think they understood each other really well and respected each other really well. So those of us who criticize another tradition are generally fairly ignorant. We don't know what we're doing. We should concentrate on getting liberated ourselves.
Sure. And in observing the physical sensations, this is contact through there's often in the West we talk about 5 senses. In Buddhism we have 6. The 6th one being the mind is considered a sense door, and there's the observation of contact in one of the sense doors, one of the sense objects in the sense doors. And Sayagyu Bakin, there's a paraphrasing here because I don't have this on hand, but in one of his talks, he referenced how one of the reasons they focus on sensation is that it's much easier for a student, especially a new student, to be able to make this observation. it's an observation that someone who doesn't have a background in meditation, doesn't have a background in Buddhist theory or Buddhism, especially since he wanted to teach people from different backgrounds. It's how to stand out from those in his day in Burma. That sensation was of the sense doors, of the six sense doors. Sensation was the one that was much easier for a student to come in and observe and then make progress in. And so there are other techniques in Burma today that will focus on the other sense doors and the observation of the other sense doors, especially mind and the mental concomitants of observing, being able to observe the observe the sense door of mind, which is, I pause in saying that because for a non-meditator Western audience, that perhaps can be somewhat confusing to imagine how the mind is a sense door like the others, but that of these six sense doors, it's the Goenka tradition and Ubakin that has taken the sensation as the one as the object of observation to note.
Yeah, and let me ask you a question about it, Doa. Let's say we are observing the mind. Someone says, just observe your mind. And anger arises in the mind, or fear, or anxiety, or depression, or anything arises in the mind, even a small thought. How can you observe that particular phenomena? How do you experience that phenomena? What do we say in English? I feel angry. I feel afraid. I feel anxious. Why? Because you feel it as a physical sensation on your body. So even if you were doing purely Dhammanupassana, Chittanupassana, which means observation of mind, observation of the mental concomitants, even if you were doing just that, your practice has to lead to the point where you experience Vedana. The word Vedana means experience, according to Goenka, where you experience those mental things as physical sensations on your body, because the mind and the body are two sides of the same coin. You can't separate them. So no matter what the approach is, and Goenka certainly quotes many of the Buddha's suttas where Buddha himself said, whatever arises on the mind manifests with physical sensations on the body, and explains it all really well if anybody wants to do the research. So what this technique does is it very rapidly, because keep in mind, when Uba Kim was alive and teaching, he was a civil servant. He was a government official with very little time. So whoever he taught, he wanted to get right to the heart of the matter. He wanted to do something in a short period of time that gave people something tangible that they would be able to practice at home for the rest of their lives, whether they were Burmese or American or European or whatever they happened to be. And so he kind of taught something that wasn't, quote, the traditional Buddhism. He taught the essence of what the Buddha taught. And because it is only the essence of what the Buddha taught that is going to give the results. And the results are the deconditioning of the mind or liberation of the mind.
Well, also in Uba Kin's day, you had himself as well as some of his disciples, Mother Sayama and Venkatriyam, just to name a couple, who had extraordinary supernatural powers. And supernatural being, maybe that's not the best word for it. I'm not exactly sure what English word to put in there, but we're able to read minds and divine prophecies and spiritual potentialities, past lives, other realms, all kinds of things. And so it was, as they say, Uba Kin rarely had a dry course, meaning that there was someone who reportedly attained almost every course he did because of these. And we've conducted a number of interviews, that many of them not released yet, but who have described in some detail, just fascinating how the circumstances around knowing the depth of practitioners that would come through these special beings as a part of IMC, and being able to divine or understand when they were close or what difficulties they were having, and the sort of specialized instructions and trainings that they would give outside of the norm, outside of the structure, just based on how advanced those teachers and some of those disciples were, that I think was not only about the technique itself that was being taught in those circumstances, but also those that were teaching and those that were at the center to be able to work in such unusual and dynamic ways with the students that were coming based on what they were facing and their spiritual background and potentiality at the time as well.
Yeah, you would. There's a story that Uba Kin he used to chant, "Only let very ready and ripe people of very good and developed paramis come to me," and he did that because he had so little time. And then Goenkaji would be walking around IMC and chanting the same thing. And Uba Kin heard him and he said to Goenkaji, he said, "You should not chant that because that is not your job. I have limited time. I only want to come across people who I can really develop as much as possible." But Goenkaji's job, and Uba Kin knew this, his job was to reach masses of the world, to throw seeds all over the world. And he did that really well. So there are very few people that have the kind of parami or quality of the people that went to Uba Kin. But there is something extraordinarily special about the people who Goenkaji came in contact, especially those who stayed with him. And
Mhm.
this is something that those people who came in contact with Uba Kin did not necessarily have. And that is the ability to serve, freely
Mhm.
serve without expecting anything in return. So think of all of these Western students, European students, even Indian students, the first centers were in India, who
Mhm.
developed to such an extent and had so much, as the words Goenkaji would use, would be enlightened devotion, not blind faith, but enlightened faith, that they wanted to help many, many other people. And so because of that motivation, because of that parami, that quality, many centers have come up around the world. Very few of those people who were with Uba Kin had the opportunity to do that. But so many of the people in India as well as in the West had the opportunity to build centers, serve people without expecting anything in return, keeping in mind that, no charges, no money involved, just giving, and continue to do that. So that quality of being able to serve was something that was absolutely critical and necessary for the development of Dhamma in the world. That's this tradition or any other tradition. And that was not something that many people in Burma at that time had the opportunity to do. We did. And it took exactly
Yeah.
that to spread Dhamma around the world. Like Goenkaji said in some of his discourses, he said, "I have two hands.
Mm.
You have thousands." And somebody said the
Mm.
other day, you may have, Goenkaji talked about thousands, but there's now millions, So it's a very
Mhm.
special human being that not only comes to the practice, but wants to help others get the practice, whether it be by sitting on the Dhamma seat or cleaning toilets or building something, you know. Uh, it's a very special human being that does that. And we can see in the world now, and I know I'm diverting the storyline here a little bit, but we live in an incredibly screwed up, polarized world right now. But yet, at the
Mhm.
same time, there's more Dhamma going on in this world now than there ever has been before.
Mhm.
So I'm hopeful that more and more people will get Dhamma, more and more people who have influence on the planet will get Dhamma,
Mhm.
and it will spread and make for a much better world than what we live in now. And that's all because of these people who want to serve.
Well, and I think your point also just touches upon just how special, talented, unique Goenkaji was in what he set up beyond just being simply a meditation teacher, but how he was able to package and present and
Mhm.
the rapport, the charisma that he had, I mean, after many years of spending time in Burma, I came to have the realization that wow, I could meet a really developed monk and a really amazing human being, but if you were just theoretically as a thought experiment, if you were going to run courses or teachings around this person, who would build the bathrooms, who would think about what to cook, who would think about
Mhm.
course registration, you really have to have so many elements, so many of the correct elements in place in order for something to take off. And I think that's something that maybe I would even venture to say you might not get enough credit for, is just putting just someone in contemporary times, putting themselves back in that context, in that history of something that had never been done before, something that had never been imagined or envisioned before. We haven't even got to the part about these courses being free, and how to this day that's a model that very few have found a way to replicate and still somewhat challenge the possibility of it, even though he proved that that could be the case. But I think putting yourself back to, and that was why I was also earlier was referencing just his early work as a teacher when he was starting out, is I think that we just have to remember how different those times were, and how there really wasn't a model. And yes, he was trained, yes, he had inspiration, he had a teacher, and there was some model to draw upon, but not what he did. I mean, not the path that he chose and the trail that he blazed. That there was no real model for what he was doing. And I think the fact that he had the whole package, not just and I think sometimes we can glamorize and just say, oh, the Dhamma takes care of itself, or the teaching was there, so it found a way. In some ways there might be a deeper spiritual truth, but I as time goes on, I don't really like hearing that or saying that so much, because I think it really ignores the fact of the hard scrabble work, and not just work, but the mental agility and flexibility in being able to respond to problems that you would never even know exist. And I think that that not just being a meditation teacher, as hard as that is, and as unique as that is to have those qualities, but to develop the whole apparatus around it to an international body. I mean, that's something truly, truly remarkable, especially when you consider there's nowhere to really look for an example of how to proceed in this way, the way that was done.
Yeah, and he was a businessman. He was extraordinarily practical. He was always warning us about spending money properly, even in publicizing that something was needed at a center or even a non-center course. How do you do that without asking for money? It was always, he told the story of Uba Khin at his center, that when anything was ever needed at the center, Uba Khin would write it on a blackboard at the center. He would leave it up on the board for 2 weeks. In that period of 2 weeks, if the need was met, it would get erased. If it wasn't met, after 2 weeks, he'd erase it anyway. So it was always with the idea and the feeling of giving people an opportunity to develop their own parami, their own quality of giving, without expecting anything in return, whether it be material giving or whether it be giving of oneself to serve a course, to clean the toilets, to cook the food. And those Westerners, and I would say many of the Indians alike, but specifically the Westerners, they had the motivation. They were so enamored and so devoted to the technique and the practice, with Goenka as the vehicle for that practice, that they were willing and able and had the skill sets to do all those different things needed for the Dhamma to grow all over the world. And we were fortunate when we started the center here in Massachusetts. He was obviously still alive. That was in 82. We had a lot of contact with him because we had no idea what we were doing. None. And so we had conversations with him all the time. He came to the center every year. And so we got a lot of experience just listening to him and sitting at his feet and hearing how he worked with students. And all of this comes back to the efficacy and the validity of the technique itself. Because if people were not getting the kind of benefit that they are getting, they wouldn't be here. Who wants to spend 10 days if nothing is going to be of benefit to my life? And so it's all because of the practice that stimulated the good qualities in people to want to do this kind of work. And Goenka was absolutely the perfect vehicle for it. And even now, Joa, all these courses, Goenka's been gone for 10 years. All these courses, as you know, are still using his recorded materials, because who could do any better? Who could, I don't know of anybody who could do what he did. And because it's not about an individual becoming some special kind of person in the community, in the society, it's about people getting the practice so they get the benefit in their own lives. And that's what he gave us. And he's still giving it to us. And that's all that matters.
Right. And I do want to follow up with that. The course materials, actually, that segues perfectly into, I had set up some time ago this responding to this criticism of of perhaps being narrow-minded, and the first part being the technique, which you've responded to, and the second part being the language around it, and that segues into these recorded materials you talk about. There have been criticisms or concerns that there's kind of an inclusive or insular language that's being expressed, as well as a kind of creative history or mythology that's told with the way the technique was preserved in pristine purity from the time of the Buddha through these lineage figures of course, Sayadaw Baken, Sayataji, and Lady Sayadaw, and that the language around the pristine purity of this technique and the singular nature that it seems to indicate of this practice, as well as which has led perhaps to less engagement with, as you look at the Buddhist world or meditative world, whichever word one wants to use, that there's not so much engagement with this practice and much of the other community out there. And I want to preface my question just by saying how much I appreciate you coming on to talk and address this. I'm a big believer in communication, and I think that if people talk with different views respectfully and they're able to air and to share, I think that's a win for everyone. I think if they're able to find common ground, or they're just able to listen to each other and to hear and to acknowledge while sharing, I think that's a win for everyone. I think a loss of communication is a loss for everyone. So often these are things that are not talked about publicly or aired publicly. And I really appreciate not just you coming on, but you also articulating and suggesting wanting to address this directly. And so with that openness in mind, that's where I want to set up the acknowledgement of these criticisms and concerns that have been voiced by both people who have left the tradition, who have been longtime Goenka students and even teachers, and have stepped down or walked away based on these concerns, among others. But we'll just stick with these concerns now, as well as people that are not in the practice and looking from outside and seeing what they might describe as a type of arrogance or insularity or lack of engagement with others.
Well, I do acknowledge the existence of these concerns. I may not agree. I do not agree with the existence of these concerns. And keep in mind, Joa, even when the center was bought in 82, this center, VMC Dhamma Dhara, every Sunday night, those of us who live locally, my wife and I were two of those people, we would meet every Sunday night. We'd sit 6 to 7 in the evening, and we'd have what we called a discussion group about anything Dhammically. And we told Goenkaji about this, and he said, no, that is not what you should be doing. He didn't want us to even discuss that stuff. And then he explained why. Everything always had to have a why to it. And the reason being was that the center existed. And so let's not say this center, but all the centers in this tradition exist for one purpose only: to teach Dhamma to anybody who willingly comes and asks for it. There is no other purpose for these courses. There's no other purpose for this center. The centers, the teaching, the tradition is not an activist tradition. We realize, and I realize, that in our society, there are many issues. There are gender issues, there are race issues, there are, you name it, there's an issue about anything. We are not going to get involved publicly in those issues. The center does not exist for that purpose, like, say, the race issue. We know, and I know, that the only real way to solve racism in this country and in the world is for people to eliminate, to decondition their minds of the root causes of racism, of gender issues, of political issues, the aversion, the craving, the ignorance. If we do not address those deep-rooted issues in every human being, I don't care how much we may know emotionally or intellectually, those deep-rooted mental conditioning, sankaras, karma, is still there. So these centers, this technique has a very unique place in society. It is not political. It is not active. It is only to give the pure Dhamma as taught by the Buddha, as I feel. And anything else we do, no matter how right it may be, no matter how intellectually correct it may be, is going to dilute that singular focus of mind. So anybody from this community or that community, this religion, this color, that color, this gender, that gender, they can all do courses because we're all exactly the same. Every one of us is guided, is controlled by natural scientific law. Our minds work the same. The conditioning is different, but the law of nature is the same for each one of us. And these courses exist only to teach people this law of nature so they can come out of their own particular conditioning. If you come out of greed, hatred, and ignorance at the depth of one's own mind, you are then going to come out of all of your prejudice, all of your issues, all of your misery. That's what's going to bring hope to this society, not just becoming an activist, which I don't disagree with. I have no problem with somebody being an activist or voting this way or that way or getting involved in any kind of issue. But I do know that the root cause has to be dealt with if you're going to have peace in the society. And so this tradition, which people may look upon as limited, as narrow-minded, to me is exactly the opposite of that. It is totally all-inclusive. Anybody closes their eyes and starts observing their own sensations and tries to develop equanimity, understanding that everything they feel is changing, has the opportunity to come out of their prejudice, come out of their anger, their fear, their misery. That's what's going to help society. And so without criticizing anybody else for what they do, maybe even people who have left this tradition, that's fine. We will continue to do this because this, we know, is what really gives benefit to individual human beings. And so we'll continue to do it without criticizing anybody.
I guess another part that concern has been mentioned is the language around the history of the tradition and the technique and the role that this perhaps outsized role for many that this question of pristine purity has played, and this feeling that perhaps this technique is the only or the most important technique that the Buddha taught, that this technique was exactly as the forebears and the lineage taught without any change, that there could be a certain sensitivity, the detractors might argue paranoia, about wanting to dilute or pollute this quote unquote pristine purity, and kind of the attention around that, which can lead to protectionist or insular or close-minded or arrogant thinking of around this feeling, this kind of specialized, gifted technique that's come to these practitioners that just creates an atmosphere of first of being perhaps a bit more closed off or closed-minded of the wider and perhaps wider critical engagement and other understanding other traditions or other methodologies, but then also of just looking at the recorded history and seeing where I would use the word mythology of the way that this not just the technique itself, but the language around how this technique came, where that fits or doesn't quite fit with some of what we know of recorded history and some of the issues with that. And so I wonder also just because this is an open conversation, and I know this is very sensitive. I want to, again, just as we're having this in the middle of having this conversation, again, just appreciate you for sitting here and being open to hearing and acknowledging this criticism and responding to, which is not so common the practice. I really want to applaud you for that, and to also just give you a chance to respond publicly to any part of that.
Well, the first thing I would say is these words, pristine purity. And I know Goenka used that quite often, but we need to consider a couple of things. One is English was not Goenka's native tongue, but that's almost irrelevant. When we talk about the pristine purity or the purity of the technique, everybody can have their own thoughts about this. I mean, like Goenka has often said, past Lady Sayadaw, we don't know the names of the teachers after that. We don't even know the name of the teacher for Lady Sayadaw. So how can we say that this goes all the way back? And when I consider it, the pristine purity, I think more in terms of the purity of Dhamma, not necessarily just the purity of this tradition. This tradition to me is extremely pure because it is a vessel. is only a vessel that holds this practice. And the practice itself holds to me the very essence of what the Buddha taught. And what is that? The Buddha taught Shila, morality, samadhi, concentration, and panya, wisdom. That is the complete teaching of the Buddha. This tradition embodies those three things, Shila, samadhi, panya. This tradition embodies the Eightfold Noble Path. And like I say, Goenka hasn't changed that since the time I had met him. But then when we say it goes all the way back to the Buddha, when I consider it, what I really consider is the essence of what the Buddha taught, which I think I've already said, and I can say it again, is the understanding of impermanence, the development of the understanding of dukkha and anatta, but through the practice of Shila, Samadhi, and Panya. To me, the purity of this practice goes all the way back to the Buddha, and there have been many people through the generations, through the centuries, that have maintained that purity, whether it's this tradition or another tradition, the purity of being able to understand the impermanent nature of all conditioned things, understanding that to decondition those things, one has to develop the perfect equanimity of mind, understanding impermanence, and thereby that's the teaching of the Buddha. That is the essence of what the Buddha taught. And any tradition that does that, even in the 10-day discourse, Goenka says, any technique that takes you to the level of feeling sensation and developing equanimity with sensation is a technique of Dhamma, is a technique of vipassana, whether you use those words or not. So whether we know the names of all of these teachers who have maintained the, quote, pristine purity, we do know by experience, and you mentioned U Ba Khin and some of the people that he dealt with, very developed people. We do know that the essence of the Buddha's teaching has remained through the generations, through the thousands of years. That is what's critical. That is what goes on. Now, is this the only tradition that has that? No, nobody ever said that. Goenka never said that. In fact, if you ever take a Satipatthana course, you will hear him say, these are just different starting points. All of these traditions, including our own, are starting points to get to a place where we understand the arising and passing away of all phenomena with the understanding of change, dukkha, and anatta. That is the purity of the technique. Right now, from what I can tell, this tradition does embody that. And so I would say it's a very pure tradition, and not getting involved in all kinds of other things, not being active socially, not engaging with other traditions. That does not demean us. That does not make us narrow-minded. But I would say just the opposite. It's giving us the opportunity to really maintain that essence of what the Buddha taught. And that is what we want to pass on to the next generations. If we do that, the teachings of the Buddha will remain. If we do not, and other people do not, and the techniques gets changed and corrupted, and Shila is not maintained, and wisdom is not developed, the teachings of the Buddha are going to disappear just like they have before. So we take it very seriously what our responsibility is. And so I look at it as very all-encompassing as opposed to narrow-minded, insular, not at all. And I don't know anybody who engaged in the world of Dhamma more than Goenka. So he was a great example. And yes, I can understand why people would say these things. Also, they don't understand. But the reality is quite different than what some of these criticisms are. And so all we can do is try to explain that as criticisms come. But as long as we keep teaching what we teach, and we keep helping people get the essence of the totality of Dhamma, I feel very happy that we're doing the right thing. I mean, Joel, what is it that we actually want in the world? You know, we want people to come out of their suffering. The Buddha said he taught two things, suffering and the way out of suffering. What Goenka taught, U Ba Khin taught, was the essence of the Eightfold Noble Path. Not that others don't do the same thing, but I know that these gentlemen, these men did that. That's what we need to maintain, that essence of the Dhamma, and not just participating in what is maybe popular in society.
I keep wanting to get back to your own journey, and I promise we will, but I keep having other questions that come as we're going off on what's now not a tangent, but a very interesting and important theoretical understanding and discussion to have. Another concern I'd like to bring to you to get your thought on is I know has been tossed around for many years as this question of quantity versus quality. Quality meaning to what extent is one looking at teacher appointments and training and development and spiritual development and attainment, at looking at the meditator's journey from start to finish would of course be some enlightenment, but if we can be a long ways off, but certainly some kind of development beyond the beginner and intermediate stage where more kind of specialized problems or issues might come up depending on the path of the individual meditator, as well as having teacher-student interaction, those being kind of the quality side, and the quantity being pretty self-explanatory of just how being able to bring these teachings of liberation to as many people as possible around the world. And should mention that the Goenka tradition is credited with delivering the Buddhist teachings in places where historically, as far as I know, the Buddhist teachings have never reached. I mean, that in and of itself is quite an achievement. And so this question of quality versus quantity, of the vast expansion, the hunger, the need for that students themselves are articulating to want to take these courses with those inherent issues of quality and organization, administration, development, etc. This has been something that I know has been quite a topic of conversation in trying to chart how to balance these. So what are your thoughts on this quality versus quantity discussion?
Well, certainly quantity is there. As you know, I mean, we see now there are hundreds of centers around the world, and almost all of them have waiting lists. So clearly the word is out there in society that these courses work, that people get the pure Dhamma. And that is really what is critical. So that is the quality side of it. That's the quantity side as well. Now, there are no other people that I know of that are Goenkas. There just aren't, you know?
Sure.
Well,
Mm-hmm.
what we do have, though, is we have many, many people, thousands of people, who are devoted people, who are experienced people to a certain extent, and who have the ability, and not everybody is the same, we know that, but have the ability to be able to transmit the teachings in a way that people from their own communities are going to understand. For example, I know that some words that Goenkaji might use in the recordings, somebody might say, what does that mean? Or they're dated, or whatever it happens to be. The assistant teachers have a very important function, or even people that have been named teachers but still play the recordings. That function is to ensure the quality. Now, everybody that comes to a course is a different human being with a different set of conditioning. How much they're going to understand, how much they're going to progress themselves is going to be different. It's all different. But what everybody is getting is the quality of a very pure seed of Dhamma, or developing a seed that they already have. So knowing that every human being is different, our job is simple. Just give everybody the Dhamma as we understand it, and let them progress as they are able to progress in the world. This is not a time like when U Ba Khin was alive, where, like you say, all these very special people, and I've heard all the same stories as you have, were around. Very special people, but very few of them compared to what's happening now. So all we really need to do is to ensure that the essence of the technique, the quality, as you say, remains. And what people do with it is going to be what people do with it. And different people are going to do different things. And clearly the hope is that there will be people in the world who will take this technique and develop it as much as they can according to their own ability and pass it on to the next generation. I think that's all we can do. Are mistakes made? Yeah, certainly mistakes are made, but everywhere mistakes are made. But one thing I will stress about all of these teachers, all of these courses, is that the very basics of what the Buddha taught, and I do stress Shila, you know, the 5 moral precepts are absolutely the base of every one of our courses. Mm-hmm. Every student takes those precepts. And without that, there is no building of a practice. You can't. If the mind is completely agitated because of our own impurities, how can we quiet the mind so that we can develop samadhi and wisdom. We can't. So it is very much stressed as far as quality is concerned that Shila is the base. Develop as much samadhi as you are capable of, and with that, learn vipassana and develop vipassana as much as you are capable of. So in my mind, I see quality and quantity kind of walking together.
Mm-hmm. And a follow-up question to that is, with now Goenka having passed away about 10 years ago, there's no, the living teacher in this tradition is there no longer. The structure remains, and one important parts of that structure are the recorded audiovisual instructions, discourses, etc. And as time goes on, as we get into later years and decades, etc., looking into the future of the organization, is there any thought or discussion about doing something to modify the way those instructions are given as generations start to be further and further removed from the living teacher and from people who even knew the living teacher? Do you foresee that these recorded instructions and discourses of Goenka will be unchanged in how they continue to be delivered into courses into the future? Or is there any wiggle room for discussion or flexibility that's happening now, and looking at as you look at delivering teachings to the current time and generation and context, etc.? Is there any thought that another type of delivery might be relevant sometime in the future, or is it seen as this kind of being the standard bearer going forward with no change in the foreseeable future?
You may, well, let's see. First of all, we know that everything is anicca. Everything changes. Goenka changed stuff from Uba Ken. He didn't change the technique. That is what is important, is that the technique itself, as generations go on, does not change. It's wonderful to have these recorded materials. Wouldn't we all love to have recorded materials of the Buddha? Wouldn't it be great to sit down and listen to his discourses, his teachings? So we are very grateful. I hope these teachings, these recordings, remain, whether they're actively used in courses or they remain as an archive for thousands of years. I'm very happy about that. If the time comes where these recorded materials are no longer fulfilling the need of the society, of the people who want to learn Dhamma, well, I think they're going to have to change. And that's going to be up to the teachers of that day, how it is done. Well, all the people I know, Goenka is a very tough act to follow. There are not many people, and I don't know anyone, honestly, who can do what he did in such a skillful way. And, he once told me he was more comfortable on stage than off stage. I don't know anybody like that. So he was a unique human being with a unique job to do given by Uba Ken, and he did it really well. I think his initial hope was that these people he named as assistant teachers would eventually become full teachers, giving their own discourse instructions and all that. But he saw things not working out quite that way. And so he said, just use the materials. It's okay. There's not a problem with that, because it's about the people who are getting the technique, not the people sitting on the Dhamma seat. So as long as there is a need to play these recorded materials, I'm very happy that we have them, because it does ensure that the, quote, purity of the technique is maintained exactly the same all over the world. And the teachers who are playing these recordings, they have a very critical function to make sure that the people who hear them understand them and are able to practice. It's all about practice. If they don't understand what's recorded, they can't practice, the technique isn't going to work. So if it comes a time where the recordings are not helping the transmission of Dhamma, something is going to have to change. And hopefully there will be people at that time who will be able to change it in a way that they still have the same enlightened devotion to Goenka, to the tradition, to Burma, to India, but they're able to transmit these same things in different words, but also having these words to always refer back to ensure that essential purity and essence of the technique remains the same. What happens in the future, I don't know. But I know that what we're doing now works really well.
Okay. And from here, let's move back to your story, which I am very interested in seeing where it goes to after this extended and very interesting and important diversion. We left off when you were in India and you had taken this course, you'd been transformed by it. You talk about the spiritual community among other Western practitioners, Sharon Salzberg, Joseph Goldstein, Graham White, Michael Stein, some of the names that were out there as you're renting temporary places in Dalhousie and perhaps going other places where the climate and teachings dictate in India. And this goes on for several years. This is some of the same refrains that were found in Michael Stein's interview. He talked about
Mm-hmm.
after several years, people then life kind of started to pick back up, and being in India was hard for many various reasons, and people also wanted to bring these teachings back to their respective home countries. So pick off in your own personal story where this exit starts to come from India and start to move homeward.
Well, after those first, say, couple of years in India, I did come home. In fact, Joseph Goldstein's mother, who owned a bungalow colony up in the Catskills, gave all of us a job at her bungalow colony for the summer.
Hmm.
And Joseph was a bus driver. I was a lifeguard. Other people were other things. And it was wonderful. But we made enough money to go back to India the following fall and just keep doing the same thing. Eventually we came back. I came back, I don't remember when, but let's just say I was back and forth in the 70s. But then my own father had a stroke in 75, I believe it was. And I was here and I took care of him for many, many years. So if I got back to India for a couple of months, I would go. If not, I wouldn't go. And I remember writing Goenka saying, I would really love to come to sit the long course at Dhammagiri this year, but I can't because I have to take care of my father. He wrote back very quickly and he said, I think Buddha did something very similar in his discourses. He said, if you're with Anicca, you're with me. Don't worry about it. Take care of your father. And those were very powerful words for me. I had lived with a family in India where the mother had a heart attack. She was an older woman. And the son, who was a close friend of mine, moved into her room, took care of her in her room, and asked me to move into the house. And I helped him. And I saw the devotion of a child to a parent. And it was amazing. It was like, this is the way it is supposed to be. So with that experience in India, when my own father got sick, there was never a choice. There was never a decision to make. I took care of my father for years. Turns out between my mother and father, it turned out to be 12 years. But in that period of time, most winters, Kate and I met at that time as well. My wife, Kate, we married in 82, very shortly after we started the center here. And we would both try to get back to India pretty much every winter for many years for Goenkaji's self-course, at least his self-course, because it was a very special time to be able to sit with him. And I know Michael told you some of those stories as well, so I won't repeat them. But just being with him, sitting those long courses, he made us ATs. And when the center started in 82, and Michael outlined that really well, there were a number of us, because it was the first center outside of India, there were a number of us and a number of people from other areas that moved here. And I know Kate and we had a situation where we had enough money at the time. We had no children. I was taking care of both of my parents. And we made the decision that this is what we were going to do for the rest of our life. As long as we could do it financially, where we did not have to go to work, we dedicated the rest of our life to developing this center. And we've also helped at other centers as well. So it was a very special time for us. And we always had Goenkaji to refer back to. You know, when somebody becomes an assistant teacher now, they have to go through a whole training program. But as Goenkaji was being trained by Uba Khin for many years and he didn't even know it, I kind of believe that Goenkaji was doing the same thing with many of us. We had the good fortune to sit at his feet, listen to him, interact with him, travel with him. And I think by osmosis, we learned how to do this. And with all the mistakes that were made, he was always there to help us. And so I know Kate and I, we dedicated the rest of our life to Dhamma and Dhamma service. And here it is, 52 years later, we're still doing the same thing. And we live about 17 miles from the center here, this center.
And there's one story I heard. I only heard the rough outlines of this. I wonder if you could confirm it or go into more detail, that when Goenkaji was first starting to lead these 10-day courses in the US, and there was this uncertainty about the model, like, are you going to charge for it? Can you really offer them freely? Is that really a model that can work? And the early days of that, there was an intention to try a course where the meditators on the course would have to pay just to cover the basic costs, and that you and your wife stepped in to cover that financially. Can you clarify that story?
It was my wife. I didn't have anything, Joe. I mean, when Goenkaji, he had this event in Bombay at the Global Pagoda in 2010 that he called the Gratitude Gathering. In that gratitude gathering, he requested that people from the first, I don't know, I think it was maybe 10 years of his teaching career, come to Bombay and meet with him. And so there was this big gathering at the Global Pagoda. And
I was there for that.
Okay, so you heard him. He called for Kate and I to stand up. We did. And he talked about Kate. And he said what Kate did was to say, if there's any shortfall in money from this course, I think it was maybe even that first course in Goshen, I'm not sure, or Sandwich, Massachusetts, the next year, 82, early in the year. She said that she would cover that. Let's make it a Dana course. And she did. But the fact is, the courses started covering themselves anyway, But that volition that Kate had to make that offer was a real impetus to start having donation-only courses, which is unique in the world. And we have never charged for a course. We have all these centers now. There are no charges. How does this work? I mean, I have seen people who are on welfare, unemployment, give $1 at the end of a course. I've seen people give hundreds of thousands of dollars. So it's all the opportunity to develop your own quality of donation, of charity, of giving, the parami of dana, a very important quality. And Goenkaji said this is what Uba Khin did, and he always wanted to do it. He started doing it in India out of a lot of fear there by the trustees, and started doing it here. And, I think the rest is history. It works at every center, and how much people appreciate it, because what it really does is it makes the Dhamma accessible to anyone, regardless of your socio-economic situation. Anybody can come. You don't, in fact, we've even rented transportation from people from different communities to come. So, these centers want the Dhamma to be for everyone. It's not specific to any one particular segment of population. It's for all. And Dana courses help to make that happen.
That's really special, though, that your wife played this role in that kind of uncertain period of trying to figure out how to incorporate these in the West and what model would work, and wanting to go this model, but also not necessarily having the confidence it could be pulled off. And Michael speaks to the uncertainty at that time, that your wife, Kate, stepping in to provide that kind of Band-Aid or that bridge or that security for just that moment when it was needed, kind of in some way was able to give a way forward for this model actually working. And it reminds me also of Sayathaji, Uba Khin's teacher. He did more than just not have students that welcome students without paying for the course, which in Burma is almost unheard of in any case. He actually paid the wages of those students who missed their work to come to the course. He paid their back wages for a time. Then he had his own financial difficulties, but at first he actually, that's incredible. He actually paid the back wages of these farmers that would come of the money that they would have made during those 10 days. But, that's just a really special memory to think of your wife playing that role. And who knows how things could have turned out differently if that moment hadn't have come to just provide confidence for the next course, the next course, the next course. And then suddenly you're in a groove and you realize, okay, maybe we got something here.
Well, she never thought of it in terms of, should I do this or not? It was just, she is probably the most generous human being I know. And it was so, for her, it was like, there's nothing else to do. Of course I will do this if I can, and it's been that way all these years. Very generous. And, you give the example of Sayataji. I believe, and I can't say it for sure, but I believe when Sayagyi started teaching in these government offices in the government of Burma, those people who sat courses probably also got paid while they were sitting, so they wouldn't lose salary.
Mm-hmm.
So this has been a tradition, as part of this tradition, for many generations, and it's really ingrained in us now. I mean, here we live in such a crazy economic world, and somebody is actually giving something without expecting anything in return. These centers in Goenkaji's tradition exist only to give something, Joa, and that is unique. And keep in mind, when somebody comes and does a course, of which you've done a number, what is the first thing they do on day 0 night of a course? They ask for the teaching. They have to surrender and ask. They're monks and nuns for that period of time, but they have to ask for the teaching. No one is selling anything. No one is charging anything. Even the people who serve courses, they are all volunteers, from the cooks to the toilet cleaners to the assistant teachers. Goenkaji used to say, I may ask you to sit on a Dhamma seat one day and clean the toilets the next day. And he tells stories about that. There were people that did it. There was a story in Burma at IMC, Uba Khin Center, where there was a Muslim man who was I believe he was a professor at the university there. He was an old student, and Muslims are very, very clean people. They don't clean toilets and all that. But this man, being so devoted, he would show up at the center at 3:00 in the morning to clean the toilets when nobody knew he was even there, and then go off to work, because he just wanted to give something to the students. So this quality of generosity, this quality of dana, is really deeply ingrained in this tradition. I'm not saying it's not ingrained in others. I'm sure it is. And so in this moneyed society we live in, to be able to give something without expecting anything in return is unique, it's wonderful, and it's a very important part of the practice.
And Sayagyi Ubakin also showed an extraordinarily flexibility in terms of his outreach to students. I don't know if this is the same Muslim in question, but a story that I heard was that when a Muslim student came to take a course from him at IMC, he removed all the Buddha statues and Buddha imageries so that there would be no distractions from him learning, which in Buddhist Burma is quite something. That's not something you hear very often. It's such a devout and religious place that he would have that he would do that so willingly and have his own initiative to do that. And to then reflect on the service aspect of it, my own life has been changed by being in Vipassana kitchens, by my own service. I mean, there've definitely been some, the long courses and the extensive time sitting, of course, that gives its benefit. That goes without saying. But some of the real great life lessons I've had, and I don't know, I might have served more than I sat. I don't know what the number is anymore, but service has definitely always been an important part of me, an important part of my time, and something that I've gained tremendously from. And when you're looking at real world applications, I mean, it's just, you would never think that you could learn so much about life by cutting carrots or cleaning toilets, but boy, you sure can.
Yes, you can. And you take that mental state back into your life. I mean, Goenkaji often said, Dhamma has to be applied in your life. It's not just so you come here for 10 days. You get better when you're here. You learn something that's going to help you, but then you go back and apply it in your life. So imagine taking somebody who has really imbibed the technique, imbibed understanding of dana, going back out into the world and helping people. even if it's an activist thing like we were talking about before, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could be active without being reactive? How can I help people who are harming society, as opposed to how can I just hurt them because they're doing something so bad? So the Dhamma has to be applied in life. I believe many people who we don't even know their names are doing exactly that. And I believe to a great extent that is why these courses have been so successful, because it's giving somebody something that they can do for themselves back in their own lives. And to me, that made Goenka probably the most unique human being on the planet. He's gone, but he's still giving the same thing. People get the Dhamma, and that's what it's about. It's not about the vehicle. It's about the practice. And that's what people take home. And that's what gives benefit in life. That's why people give dana. That's why courses and centers keep going.
And I want to veer the conversation back to Burma, both in my life, Goenkaji's life, your experiences there as well. I want to get to, but I went to Burma initially in 2003 and going as a vipassana meditator in the Goenka tradition, then going to live in 2007, where I was lucky enough to get employment at a time when it was difficult for foreigners to be there more than 28 days. Very fortunate to be there at that time, and then to go on for 15 years of living there. And one of my real intrigues in wanting to go and live beyond just a short visit was seeing this tradition and this practice that had changed my life so profoundly, and which I just had so many questions of where did it come from? How did it come to be? Where did it pull from? And going to Burma gave many of those answers, and seeing many times that first year or two that I was in Burma, different conversations, different experiences, different things I saw that would then say, oh, well, this is kind of what I learned from the course, or this is what was incorporated in the course, or this is where, this discourse or this practice or this kind of system, this is kind of on more native ground with deeper roots. This is what was pulled from. And that was so inspiring. And I'm saying this now because I'm thinking of the memory of giving service and how I would be at, and that was, as someone who was young and ambitious and had these aspirations, I have to say my first course serving was hard. And I still remember mentally, physically, it was hard, but mentally it was hard. And I still remember why. I remember being in my early 20s and cutting carrots in a Vipassana kitchen, and the first couple days having all this resistance and aversion of like, I wanted to be something in life. I didn't want to just cut carrots. What am I doing here? Like, what is this greater world that I'm meant to explore and I'm meant to make my mark? And I am in this kitchen cutting 50 carrots. And is this really what I'm supposed to do? So I had like all this stuff coming up of like who I thought I was and what I wanted to be, and how I was, I felt that I had somehow veered from these great things I wanted to accomplish in life, until I then started to learn the beauty and the simplicity, and how much I could observe my mind, my body, my sensations, and my interactions with others, and then make a transformation into like, there's no more carrots to cut. Like, can I just cut some more for tomorrow? Because, I got so in the groove of just of what that experience was, of those small things. And as Mother Teresa said, the famous quote that I then learned as I was in those kitchens, I'm done with doing, again, paraphrasing, I'm done with doing big things for life. It's doing small things with great love and big heart. And I learned that there. And then being in Burma, being at monasteries and seeing local villagers come to the monastery and say, well, we're coming to clean the toilets, or we're coming to bring this rice or this curry, or we're coming to have this 1 hour Dhamma lesson or Pali lesson that we're going to learn, or to sweep the Dhamma hall or wherever it was. And realizing that this kind of, as an ambitious person who wanted to accomplish these big things, my first course serving, and the barriers and the obstacles that were in front of me, and feeling that why am I doing these menial things? I should be accomplishing something so much more. This is the path I want to be on. Then being in Burma and seeing the sense of service they had there, and the joy they had, the purpose they had, the confidence they had in, and this is something I really love about Burmese Buddhist people and my time with them that I've learned from, is just the confidence that's developed of like, I have done a good deed. maybe I've given $1, 1,000 chat to a monastery. Maybe I've swept the floor. Maybe I've offered some rice. But whatever it is, clean the bathrooms. I have done a good deed, and I rejoice in my deed with pure confidence and happiness, and won't you rejoice with me? And as a typical Westerner that's always self-doubting and full of my own flaws and vulnerabilities and imperfections, and struggling with those kind of modern anxieties, as so many of us do, to just have this simplicity of action that I have done a good deed and I am celebrating this good deed. That's changed my life forever, is being around that among Burmese people, which is then those elements incorporated into the course and organization structure of how one is able to give and to take joy in the mental intentions and physical activity of service to others. And being in Burma was so wonderful, that side of it, because so many things that were kind of packaged into this intensive course experience and organizational structure in Burma, living there with such time to be able to observe these things. They don't all come at once, but they unfold slowly, and being able to observe these elements that was like, oh, this is what Goenka meant when he said this, or this is how, the organization is kind of working in this way. And this is what I'm seeing in Burmese society. So kind of going back to those roots and the society he came from and that U Ba Khin was born from, and seeing where those were pulled, where different aspects were pulled to make that core structure and organizational culture, that was really wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah. I think Goenkaji, if he heard what you just said, I believe he would just say sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Which is why, Joa, we have so much respect and gratitude to Burma, regardless of what's going on over there now. The country of Burma is the place that kept the pure Dhamma alive, regardless of the tradition. Burma kept this Dhamma alive for thousands of years. Even if it was just from a few people to a few people, it was kept, let's say, pristine purity for any tradition to make use of. And for that, we are eternally grateful. And which is why at some of our centers, we have put up Burmese-style pagodas, zaydis, to always remind us in the next generations of that powerful connection to Burma, who kept this technique, to that powerful connection to India, of which Goenkaji started his mission, essentially. And so that connection to Burma and India remains a very powerful factor in the practice itself, because when you remember that practice, and Goenkaji talks about this in the long courses, when you have right thought about that kind of activity, that kind of beauty, it brings a great deal of joy to you. And that joy leads to better samadhi, leads to more wisdom, more equanimity, and stronger practice. So remembering what Burma has done for us is a very important thing. And those of us who knew Burma, who spent time there, yourself more than anyone I know, will always carry that with you. And I believe we have a very big responsibility to pass that on to the coming generations, whether they ever go to Burma or not. They need to know where this technique has been maintained. And that's why we get it now. If it wasn't for Burma, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something I want to emphasize because for a couple of reasons. One is that in these terrible times that are going on now and the terrible curtain of dictatorship that's come over that country since 1962, Burma has a reputation among many in the world outside this relatively small meditator community of being kind of a poor, broken country that's in need of support and perhaps even pity. And that it's this one-way giving of the international community to just continue to help this poor country. And that's a narrative that I'm always trying to pick at on this platform, and not just looking at the reciprocal nature of giving, but look at Burma as the giver, look at this as the source of this kind of wisdom and this and this generosity and this giving to places that have then animated the world. And so I wonder if you can speak to that, if you can think of the Burmese listeners that we have to this that are perhaps feeling a bit down in terms of the ongoing struggle that's come, and just speak to yourself and the community that you represent and what Burma has meant to you and means to you.
Well, it certainly meant a great deal to me. You know, when I did my very first course, Uba Kim was still alive. And I wrote to him because I wanted to go to Burma even then. That was 1970.
Mm.
I wanted to meet him, but he had died in the meantime.
Mm-hmm.
It never happened. But, you
Mm.
know, Goenkaji himself was so devoted to Burma and Goenkaji. One of Goenkaji's strongest qualities was his gratitude. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
he
Mm-hmm.
had that global pagoda built for the purpose of showing his gratitude to Ubaken, to Burma, and to the
Mm.
Buddha. You know, so that example of that kind of gratitude was instilled in us. We experienced it firsthand by sitting at IMC, by traveling around Burma when they finally let us travel around Burma. I can't think of a more wonderful and beautiful place in the world than Shwedagon Pagoda.
Mm-hmm.
You know, to me, I see pictures of it, and especially you go there at like, 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning when there's
Mm-hmm.
no crowds. It's just, it's just such a mecca of beauty and reminder, not just physical beauty, but the
Mm-hmm.
reminder of look what these people in this country have done for us, what they've given. We're the recipients here. We're the poor ones here. Burma's the rich one.
Mm-hmm.
And they gave us something that has the ability to change the world that we live in, including the world they live in. They need it now more than anybody.
Mm.
Uh, and Goenkaji, with his love for Burma, look how many centers are in this tradition now in Burma. Quite a number. I don't know how many, but a lot.
Sure.
And so all of this is the result of gratitude to what Burma gave the world. And we keep that in mind, when we practice every day, when we generate metta for all beings, we should remember Burma. And when I see, we have Burmese courses at least once or twice a year here, and we have Burmese teachers who come. And when I see that some of these Burmese, they never got Dhamma in Burma, they got it here. They live in New York, they live in Boston, wherever they live.
Mm-hmm.
And they are the most grateful human beings I've ever met,
Mm.
and when I see them come to the center, they're coming with carloads of food and
Mm-hmm.
supplies. And I mean, when the Cambodians show up, it's the same thing. When they show
Mm-hmm.
up, I've never seen so much food in my life,
Mm.
and even in the middle of a course, they bring more. They renew the supplies. And all of this is because of gratitude that they have for the Dhamma. And so
Mm-hmm.
we have gratitude for them. We have gratitude for what they have done, because if it wasn't for them, we would not have this center. We would not be doing what we're doing now. So that gratitude becomes an essential and critical part of our own practice so that we can actually develop. Gratitude is critical, important.
And I think this is also important because another reputation Burma has, which has some truth in it, although it's not the full truth, is the isolationist country. That it's a country that has been isolated and cut off from the rest of the world, which is true to some extent, again, given the unfortunate recent history. But that I think that does not get at the fact of its greatest export through certainly this tradition. Mahasi has also been has exported teachings in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
These are the two primary ones, but through these two traditions and through this tradition particularly that we're talking about in this conversation, that when you try to characterize Burma as this isolationist country, isolation meaning not much is getting in, not much is getting out. Well, maybe it's true that not much was getting in over the past half century or whenever it was due to the xenophobia that the military had. But to say not much was getting out, this is a story that is not really being told outside of yourself and those in those communities who know better, who are part of these thriving spiritual meditative communities that have grown based on these Burmese lineages and have this gratitude and this knowledge. But that's not a story that's getting out so much outside of these communities, which is why I want to be so explicit about it here, for those who haven't taken a course or aren't aware of this influence and dynamic, that this export of this meditation technique coming from a Burmese lineage this has influenced just so many people around the world in such profound ways. This is an export coming from Burma, a spiritual export coming from Burma, which has made its mark on the world, and I dare say changed the world to some degree. So let us not forget this.
I agree with you. You know, when Goenka left Burma to go teach his parents in '69, I believe the story is something like he was at customs leaving Burma, and they said something like, "Are you taking anything
Right.
with you?" And he's, "Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
taking a jewel." And they all
Yeah.
freaked out because then he explained, "I'm taking the jewel of Dhamma."
Uh-huh.
And this is exactly what has happened. And the beauty is the proof how people's lives have changed. And this is because of what Burma did. And I mean, it changed Goenkaji's life. He wouldn't be where he is now, or wherever he is, or all these years, if it wasn't for his connection with Burma and Ubaken. And so none of this is an accident. It is not an accident that Goenkaji came in contact with Ubaken, not an accident that Goenkaji had the skill set and the parami to reach millions of people around the world, and not an accident that this has become the greatest export that Burma could ever hope to give to the world. So the gratitude that goes along with that when you remember it is enormous. It's really enormous. So maybe we could say Burma is the greatest exporter on the planet.
Right. And it, when you look at just the bridge he made in being able to package and deliver this, what's coming to mind now is when my mom, who also has sat many courses in this tradition, when she came to Burma and I took her to visit different monasteries, she said, it's really interesting because there would be a lot of things at these monasteries, and some of them we even slept at or meditated at more than just casual visits. He said, there's things at this monastery that either I wouldn't understand and would be very foreign, or I would actually have aversion to. I would actually look at in terms of, something just overly religious or rites or rituals or these other things, but just simply coming from a 10-day course experience, I can see how these things we're seeing at monasteries, I can see how this is what came to the course experience, whether it's waking up at 4 a.m, whether it's not eating any food after 12 noon, whether it's some of the protocol involved in monastics, even though it's a lay tradition. So that part's not there as much, but, or Shila or these other things. And I say this because that bridge was so important. If you take my mom as an example, and so many people would fit into that category, so much is given to you when you come to that 10-day course, hand delivered to you to then just go on the conveyor belt and practice the way you're supposed to, with things explained and presented in the way they are. If one were to come without those kind of linguistic, cultural, religious, spiritual, whatever backgrounds and just show up at this place of practice, the barriers for being able to understand the barriers also that could produce hesitations and discomfort and even aversion, that because of the way he's handcrafted that kind of delivery to a new student, it enables someone to first learn there, but then when they go to Burma, as in the case of my mom and in so many others, that the native Buddhist culture there and meditative environment, that those things, even though they're definitely very different from a course and rooted in their own cultural and religious experience, they're things that are not too far of a stretch away for a Vipassana practitioner in the Goenka tradition to be able to make those couple steps on their own and to realize, this is where it came from, and this is this is more in its kind of natural form in this country, how it's being practiced. And indeed, many practitioners, many meditators from Goenka tradition have gone on to be lifelong monastics of monks and nuns, and sometimes in different traditions, but and sometimes have gone very deep into renunciation. And so many of them, I mean, countless, so many that have come on this platform, whether they continue to take courses or feel that they've kind of veered off into other forms of practice, but so many of them will credit that those early courses and the course structure that Goenka created as being the thing that was able to deliver that message to them. If they had, even these lifelong monastics, if they had showed up at these monasteries where they end up renouncing and living their lives, they wouldn't have had that connection if not for the taste of Dhamma that they had through these courses, which then made it appealing and amenable to wanting to develop deeper into that practice. So it really, for those that never go to Burma, it's the spiritual tradition it gives is in and of itself. But for those that go, it's this, it really is an extraordinary bridge that without that, it just doesn't make as much sense, and it's much harder to make sense of or integrate.
Yeah, but let's remember, Joe, that Goenkaji was very fond of saying that the Buddha was a super scientist. Everything has to have a why. You have to understand why we're doing what we are doing. He understood the background of people to such an extent that you did not have to be a Buddhist renunciate or Christian or Jewish or any Muslim or anything else. You just had to be able to observe. And he conducted these courses. He taught in such a way that people did not have to accept anything blindly. You accept only what you experience. And now here's the tool for you to experience. And in that way, people could actually understand the Buddha's teachings at an experiential level, which made them appreciate all of the other things, like the monastic society, like the renunciations, like what Burma has done for us. It enabled people to appreciate that much more because they actually understood the essence of Dhamma, not the essence of a religion, but the science of how this mind and body work so that we could come out of our misery. That's what the Buddha taught, and that's what Goenkaji gave us. And that's why we're so grateful to Burma, because it was there that that essence was maintained.
And I'm thinking as well now, I'm remembering that when my mom was first sitting her first few courses, the not eating after 12 noon was always somewhat kind of annoying and confusing to her and not just kind of seemed kind of arbitrary. And then on her first visit to Burma and realizing the monks' Vinaya and the monastic order and such, it was just like this, oh, that's why we do this. That's why we follow this. And it just all kind of sunk into place.
Yeah,
But I also
if
want to...
you do a 10-day course and you need food after 5, we will give it to you. If it's for the health of your body, so you can practice, we'll give you whatever you need, pretty much.
Right. But it also just kind of highlights, the depth of where this came from in making that course package. But I also want to ask about your visits to Burma and perhaps end with that. And if you could take us to, you mentioned how you wrote a letter to Sayagyi Baken in 70 before he died. That's wonderful to hear. And I'm sorry that you weren't able to actually meet him directly. And then with the political problems, going there as a foreigner, even a practitioner, was difficult for many years. So when did you finally get to Burma, and what were your impressions of being there?
Well, I got there in 73. And at that time, as I think Michael explained, we were only allowed to be there for a week. We got a 7-day visa. We were picked up at the airport. We were taken to IMC. We sat for a week. We were taken to the airport. We flew to Thailand, renewed our visa for another week, came back and sat another week. And that went on for some years. And then I think it was somewhere around 78, 79. Michael and I actually went to Burma together for a course where we ordained as monks. The first day we would become samanera. The second day we were taken to some big hall in Rangoon somewhere, Yangon, and we took vows as full monks. And it was a very special time. We were allowed to stay in Burma then for 2 weeks, and it was a 2-week course. And we did it as monks. And I've never seen care like the Burmese people took care of us. I mean, the food that was brought to the center was outrageous. We couldn't eat it all. And but they were just so filled with joy to serve the monks. And so I did that. And some years later, my wife and I and some other friends, we went another time, maybe once or twice more, I don't know. And at that point, we were given, I think, 30-day visas. So at that time, we were allowed to travel. And Goenkaji's family helped us get visas to go up to Moguk and some other places. And so it was fantastic to just spend a month being a hippie again in Burma. Really enjoyed it.
So when you went in 73 and then 78, I assume Mother Sayama was there. Was Webu Sayadaw also present when you went
Webu
to IC?
Sayadaw, I think he died shortly after maybe the first time I went. But I was not one of the people that met him, unfortunately. I know there are a number of Westerners who I know that did meet him. This is he is another really good example. Webu Sayadaw was not of this tradition as we know it. Webu Sayadaw is the one that told Uba Khin to start teaching. Webu Sayadaw was incredibly highly respected and accomplished and he attained obviously a lot, but he was very close to Uba Khin. So in spite of not being in the same tradition, that essence of what Uba Khin was teaching and what Webu Sayadaw taught was the same. And I think that's a lesson we could all learn from, with different traditions, even in the West now.
Mm-hmm. So your time at IMC, you didn't have the fortune of meeting Webu, but you did meet Mother Sayama, I assume.
Yeah.
So what
I knew Mother Sayama quite well. Goenka spoke really highly of her. He says she was 2 years his junior in physical age, but at the same time, he's the one I think that gave her the name Sayama, which means teacher, mother teacher, and because he thought of her as his mother. So she was very, very gracious and helpful to many of the Western students that came. And we knew her in Burma. We knew her when she would come to India, So we got to know her quite well. And I also got to know, just so you realize, Munindra was my first teacher. So I also got to know, excuse me, I got to know Deepa Ma very well also in those early years. And I've never met somebody who was kind of so empty as she was. She was just such a wonderful human being. Well, she lived in Calcutta. She used to come to Bodhgaya once a year in the winter when Munindra was there. And because she didn't speak English, she would come with her daughter, who I think spoke English, but Munindra was always the translator for her. So we just got to spend a lot of time with her, quality time, talking to her about the Dhamma, talking about her own practice, and being with someone who really exhibited qualities of egolessness, I dare say, and just a wonderful human being. I loved her very much.
Another thing I realize I'm also curious with that we touched upon an earlier era and didn't get this question out. And you're talking about this early spiritual community, and you mentioned some of the names that you and Michael Stein and others have stayed with the tradition and Goenka's teachings. Others, Graham White is in the Mahasi field, and then you have people like Joseph Goldstein and Sharon Salzberg that are more independent teachers. And so I wonder, as you reflect back on this time, I mean, there must be some nostalgia as you think of these early days when the organization, identities, labels weren't so much there. You're all just young people practicing these different traditions as they're coming and growing in that. Michael Stein does a marvelous job describing just the feeling and the energy of those early times. And then as the years move on, as it does with anything, there start to be cliques or labels or organizations, identifications, and people move in different directions and identify with it becomes less free-flowing and less kind of nebulous as people start to move more towards identifications and labels, as happens in life. And so what are your thoughts as you look back on those early years and your time there, and then as you look on the growth of the movement and probably into something you never could have imagined at that time, into what this organization, movement, whatever you want to call it, what it's become?
Well, clearly back in those early years, early 70s, there was not much differentiation. Like I say, Munindra sat next to Goenka, my first course. So there wasn't much in the way of differentiation. But I do want to say that, and I loved all those people. I still consider them my friends, just like Michael said. We try to meet with Joseph as often as we can. And, I could say that whenever I get together with Joseph, even if it's been a number of years we haven't seen each other, it's still like we had never been apart. He's still one of the most wonderful, nicest human beings I've ever met in my life. And so all credit to Joseph. The one thing that Goenka was really strong on, and this was from the very beginning, Joa, is that he wanted people to get liberated. This technique is not about just living stress-free lives in the world. This technique is about deconditioning our minds, which is the hardest thing a human being can do. Clearly, there's nothing more difficult than that. So what Goenka wanted was people to make that strong determination that if that's what you want to do with your life, whatever technique, this tradition, that tradition, doesn't make any difference, but take it to its ultimate limit. Get liberated. And he was never a fan of people mixing techniques. A little bit of, okay, I'll do a little bit of Goenkaji's technique. I'll do a little bit of Mahasi Sayadaw. Then I'm going to go over here and do a little bit from the Thai tradition or whatever it is, Burmese tradition. He was not a fan of that. Never.
Mhm.
But he wanted people to make a decision. You remember from the 10-day course. What is one of the last things he says on day 10 night when he talks about dig a well 10 feet, 10 feet, 10 feet? But not to do that, because you're never going to reach water. Don't go to this technique for 15 minutes, another technique for another couple of days, another one for... Once you find the technique, the tradition that you are very comfortable with, stay with it. Take it to its ultimate limit and get liberated, which means we're all going to learn the same thing, anicca, anatta, and dukkha. The early years, this was all one big sort of confused, happy family. As the years went on, Joseph came back, Sharon came back, others came back, and people started practicing in their own way, opening up other centers, etc. All that, fine. But what he didn't want people to do was to mix techniques. Even now, what does he say in his own 10-day courses to new students? Regardless of what you have done in the past, for these 10 days, do just this technique so you can actually see if this is beneficial for you. Now, once somebody finds that a particular technique is beneficial for them, it seems to me they've reached the stage, let's say within that Satipatthana Sutta, where they understand the arising and passing of phenomena. Stay with it. Take it to its ultimate end, which is the liberation of mind, as opposed to starting all over somewhere else once you've reached such a subtle stage anyway. Goenkaji knew that right from the beginning. He was very forgiving, because this was all new. He didn't want to put people off. But as the years went on, it's not that he wasn't forgiving. He was always forgiving. But as time went on, people got more and more serious about their practice. He emphasized this aspect of it more and more. It's not that he withdrew, you had to do this technique, this is the only technique on the planet. He never said that. People might have put those words in his mouth, but he never said that. I know I was in the room when Sharon and Joseph and Danny Goldman went to meet him the last time he was here. He had so much love for those people. I've never seen so much metta flowing. He always considered all of those people, and I'm sure he did to the day he died, his children, and even Ram Dass, he loved Ram Dass. He said when he was on tour in 2002, he said, if I knew Ram Dass was here and sick, I would have gone to see him. He didn't even know. So he was that kind of a man, so it's not a matter of, exclusion of anybody. It's a matter of inclusion of everybody, but trying to make sure people practice whatever they're comfortable with to get the final goal, liberation of mind. But with that experience, if somebody reaches somewhat more mature stages of practice, that's going to give them a great deal of confidence or enlightened devotion. Why would they want to do anything else? All of a sudden, some teacher, whoever it is, has given me the path to get enlightened, and I reach a certain stage, my gratitude toward that teacher is going to increase even more. It doesn't mean I need to go to another person and start all over again. Let my gratitude arise. I'll understand everything even more. This is, I think, where Goenkaji was coming from, and I believe it's the right thing. And we have to keep in mind why we are meditating. I've said it before, but it bears repeating at the end of this interview. We are meditating to purify the mind to its ultimate limit as much as we can in this life. And so if we are not doing that, if we're just playing games, a little bit of this and a little bit of that, we're not going to get what we really want. It's not what we came for. So that emphasis on enlightened devotion based on experience and taking the technique to its ultimate limit with any technique is absolutely critical if you want to reach that goal.
Right. Well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story, which also intersects with this wider movement and teaching and putting that on the radar in the public space. I think it's great to hear your story and journey, and for all of those who have been impacted by Burma itself or by different spiritual traditions or this particular tradition. I think this is very relevant for our listeners to come away with.
You're welcome. Happy to do it, Joa.
चित अविचल हो जाए, अविचल चित निर्मल बने, सहज मुक्त हो जाए.
We want to take a moment to introduce you to our nonprofit Better Burma's online shop, which features handicrafts sourced from artisan communities scattered throughout Myanmar. Far from being mass-produced knockoffs, the pieces we offer are unique and handmade, reflecting the wide diversity of different peoples found throughout the country. When Myanmar experienced its transition period, moving from democracy in the late 2010s after decades of harsh military dictatorship, many Burmese craftspeople hoped their beautiful work could finally be appreciated beyond the country. When Myanmar experienced its transition period, moving towards democracy in the late 2010s after decades of harsh military dictatorship, many Burmese craftspeople hoped their beautiful work could finally be appreciated beyond the country's borders. But sadly, this was not to be so. Following the military coup, many skilled artisans suddenly found all possibility of continuing their livelihood closed off and began struggling just to feed their families. With this in mind, we prioritize working with artisans from disadvantaged and vulnerable backgrounds because we know just how hard it can be to survive at the margins of society in Myanmar. This includes such people as those with disabilities, mothers who have contracted HIV/AIDS, civil servants on CDM, ethnic and religious minorities, and more. To view these wonderful pieces, please visit alokacrafts.com. That's Aloka, A-L-O-K-A, crafts, C-R-A-F-T-S. One word, alokacrafts.com. Otherwise, please consider a donation through our usual channels. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects, as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause in both websites except credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give it another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.
Bisaya. Bodhava Yaranangaya Unyana Dadu Yadanam Yodiganida Mana Vigada Bisayana Bisaya. Ruba Yarananda Dayananga Yaranaya Dayanam Bodhava Yaranam.